In the summer of 1940, Germany had a complete plan to invade Britain. The maps were ready, the units were assigned, the transports were prepared, and then the order was never given. This is not a video about plans that failed. It is about plans that were deliberately not used. World War II is usually explained through the actions that were taken, but some of its most important outcomes were shaped by decisions that stopped just short of execution. Not because they were impossible, but because the people responsible understood that once certain actions begin, control may never return. This video examines 5 such decisions. The history of World War II is usually told through the actions that were taken, the invasions that were launched, the campaigns that succeeded or failed. But there is another history, less visible, that runs parallel to it. It is the history of restraint, of military options that were available but not pursued, of strategic doors that were opened, examined, and then closed, of moments when the machinery of war was ready to move and the order to proceed was never given. Each of the plans examined here was developed by official military or political authorities during the war. Each reached a level of operational planning that made execution theoretically possible. And each was abandoned or indefinitely postponed, not because of external failure, but because of deliberate decision. What emerges is not a story of missed opportunities. It is a story of calculated refusal, of leaders who understood that some actions, once begun, could not be controlled, that some gambles, even if winnable, carried costs too severe to justify. Operation Sea Lion was Nazi Germany's proposed invasion of Britain, scheduled for September 1940. It was not a vague ambition. It was a fully articulated military operation with assigned divisions, transport schedules, and landing zones along the southern English coast. The plan called for an amphibious assault across the English Channel, supported by airborne units and preceded by the destruction of the Royal Air Force. The German army prepared detailed maps. The Kriegsmarine assembled barges and converted river transports. The Luftwaffe began sustained bombing campaigns to achieve air superiority. By late summer 1940, the plan had reached a level of readiness that made invasion plausible within weeks. And then it was postponed. The standard explanation is that Germany lost the Battle of Britain, that the Luftwaffe failed to destroy the RAF, and without air superiority, an invasion became too risky. This explanation is correct, but incomplete. The deeper issue was not just air superiority, it was the nature of amphibious invasion itself. Germany had never conducted a large-scale seaborne assault. Its naval forces were vastly inferior to Britain's Royal Navy. The logistical demands of moving an army across open water, keeping it supplied, and defending the transport vessels from naval counterattack were unprecedented for the German military. Even if the initial landing succeeded, sustaining it was uncertain. German leadership understood this. Planning records reveal persistent doubts, not about whether an invasion could be launched, but about whether it could be controlled once underway. The invasion of Britain was not refused because it was impossible. It was refused because it introduced a level of operational uncertainty that German leadership was unwilling to accept. Germany's military doctrine emphasized rapid, decisive campaigns with clear objectives. The invasion of Britain offered no such clarity. It promised weeks or months of attritional fighting on unfamiliar terrain, dependent on a naval supply line Germany could not reliably defend. This was not a failure of planning, it was a recognition of limits. The invasion remained on paper, and Britain remained unconquered. Operation Tannenbaum was Nazi Germany's plan to invade Switzerland, developed in 1940 following the fall of France. The German General Staff drew up detailed invasion routes through the Swiss Alps, identified key transportation choke points, and estimated the forces required to overcome Swiss resistance. The plan anticipated that Switzerland could be conquered in a matter of days or weeks, depending on the level of resistance encountered. Switzerland was surrounded on all sides by Axis-controlled or Axis-aligned territory. Its military was small, its strategic value was real, but limited. And yet the invasion was never ordered. Not because Switzerland was too strong, not because the terrain was impassable, but because the cost of occupation outweighed the benefit. Swiss military doctrine, developed over decades, was based on a strategy of denial. If invaded, the Swiss army planned to retreat into fortified positions in the Central Alps, destroy key infrastructure, and sustain prolonged resistance. This would not prevent a German victory, but it would deny Germany the very thing it wanted: intact rail tunnels and functioning transport routes. If Switzerland destroyed its own infrastructure, Germany would gain territory but lose access. The occupation would also require a sustained military presence in difficult terrain, tying down divisions that could be used elsewhere. Switzerland offered no industrial base, no significant natural resources, and no strategic depth that Germany did not already possess through its control of France and Austria. The decision not to invade was not moral. It was practical. Germany chose not to pay the cost of controlling what it could not productively use. Operation Pike was a joint Anglo-French plan to bomb Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, developed between late 1939 and early 1940. At that time, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Soviets were supplying Germany with oil, grain, and raw materials. Britain and France, at war with Germany since September 1939, saw this as material support for their enemy. The plan called for long-range bomber strikes against Soviet oil facilities at Baku and Grozny. The goal was to cripple Soviet oil production and deprive Germany of a critical resource. The operation was studied seriously. Flight routes were mapped. Diplomatic arrangements were made with Turkey and Iran. Bomber squadrons were allocated. By early 1940, the plan was technically ready to execute. And then it was abandoned. Not because it was unfeasible, not because the Soviets discovered it, but because the underlying strategic logic collapsed. In May 1940, Germany invaded France. The entire focus of the Allied war effort shifted to the defense of French territory. Long-range bombing operations against the Soviet Union became irrelevant overnight. But there was a deeper reason the plan was never carried out. Bombing Soviet oil fields would have risked pushing the Soviet Union into a closer alliance with Germany. It might have triggered a Soviet military response against British and French interests in the Middle East or Asia, and it would have opened a second front at a time when Britain and France were barely managing the first. The potential gain did not justify the potential cost. Operation Pike was refused because it would have created new enemies faster than it neutralized existing ones. Operation Downfall was the United States military's plan for the invasion of Japan, scheduled to begin in late 1945. It was the official operational plan approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and President Harry Truman. The plan consisted of two phases. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, was scheduled for November 1945. Operation Coronet, the invasion of the Tokyo region, was scheduled for March 1946. The United States military assembled the largest amphibious force in history. Troop ships were positioned. Landing craft were built. Supplies were stockpiled in the Pacific. Casualty estimates varied, but internal military documents projected hundreds of thousands of American dead and wounded. Japanese military and civilian casualties were expected to reach into the millions. The plan was ready, and then it was not carried out. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Japan's surrender, made the invasion unnecessary. This was not a matter of luck. It was a deliberate choice to avoid the costs of invasion. From a strategic perspective, the decision not to invade Japan was a decision not to accept a human cost that could be avoided. Operation Downfall was refused because an alternative existed that achieved the same objective without prolonged ground combat. Operation Unthinkable was a contingency plan developed by the British Chiefs of Staff in May 1945, at the direction of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The plan outlined a potential military offensive against the Soviet Union. Its objective was to force a withdrawal from Eastern Europe and impose a more favorable settlement. The plan called for a coalition of British, American, and remaining German forces to attack Soviet positions in Central Europe. This was not a vague proposal. It was a formal military study with force estimates and logistical assessments. And it was rejected almost immediately. The Red Army vastly outnumbered available Western forces. Public support for a new war was non-existent. Even if initial operations succeeded, there was no clear path to victory. The plan risked starting a war that could not be controlled. Churchill accepted this assessment. Operation Unthinkable was filed away. 5 plans, 5 refusals, each for different reasons, all reflecting the same principle. War requires not only the capacity to act, but the judgment to know when not to. None of these were failures of planning. None were failures of will. They were exercises in strategic discipline. The ability to prepare for action and then choose not to act is as important as the ability to act decisively when required. If you found this analysis valuable, consider leaving a comment with your thoughts. And if you are interested in more documentary content that examines why events unfolded the way they did, subscribe to the channel.